The Socratic problem occupies a central and unusually difficult position in the history of philosophy because it concerns not merely the interpretations of a thinker's ideas, but the very possibility of knowing whether those ideas can be attributed to a historical individual at all. At its core, the Socratic problem asks how to whether At its core, the Socratic problem asks how or whether scholars can reconstruct the philosophical beliefs, methods, and intention of Socrates. Given that he left no written works of his own and is known only through the testimonies of others whose accounts diverge sharply in context, tone, and purpose. Unlike most foundational figures in Western philosophy, Socrates survives entirely at a mediated presence. Filtered through literary, philosophical, comedic, and retrospective lenses, this makes the problem not simply one of interpretation but of epistemic limits in historical knowledge. The difficulty begins with the nature of the surviving sources. Socrates wa- was a real historical figure executed in Athens in 399 BCE, yet everything attributed to him comes from writers who had their own agendas, intellectual commitments, and audiences. The most extensive and influential portrayal comes from Plato, Socrates' student, whose dialogue places Socrates at the center of philosophical inquiry. However, Plato was himself one of history's greatest original thinkers, and it is implausible to assume that the decades of philosophical development left no imprint on the character through whom he expressed his ideas. In Plato's early dialogues, Socrates appears primarily as a questioner who dismantles others and claims to knowledge, while in later works he articulates complex metaphysical doctrines, political theories, and cosmologic accounts that almost certainly exceed what historical Socrates taught. This raises the question of whether Socrates ends and Plato begins, and a boundary that cannot be cleanly drawn. Complicating matters further is the testimony of Xenophon, another associate of Socrates, whose writings depict a marked different figure. Xenophon's Socrates is practical, morally earnest, and concerned with everyday virtue rather than abstract metaphysics. In the works such as Memorabilia and Oceanomicus, Socrates appears as a moral advisor offering constructive guidance, not as a relentless dialectical provocateur seen in Plato. Xenophon also portrays Socrates as more conventional in religious and civic matters, arguably to defend against the charges that led to his execution. Divergence between Plato and Xenophon's portrayal is so pronounced that accepting one offer often seems to require discounting the other, yet rejecting either risks discarding valuable historical testimony. An even more disruptive source is Aristophanes, whose comedy "The Clouds" presents Socrates as a sophist, a natural philosopher, a corrupter of youth, who teaches clever arguments of immoral ends. While this portrayal is satirical, it cannot be dismissed outright because Aristophanes was a contemporary of Socrates and wrote during his timeline. The play suggests that at least some Athenians associated Socrates with intellectual subversion, impiety long before his trial. However, comedy exaggerates for effect, and Aristophanes' goal was not historical accuracy, but social critique. The challenge lies in determining how such historical residue remains once the cosmetic distortion is stripped away, a task for which there is no reliable methodical tool. Later, still, Aristotle offers a more analytical perspective on Socrates, yet his account is derivative and retrospective. Aristotle didn't know Socrates personally and relied on Plato and other sources. He credits Socrates with developing inductive reasoning and the search for universal definitions while explicitly denying that Socrates held the theory of forms, which Aristotle attributes to Plato. Aristotle's testimony is often treated as sober and philosophical, but it is too shaped by Aristotle's own systematic concerns and his trace and desire to the genealogy of philosophical concepts. As such, even Aristotle cannot function as an impartial arbiter of Socratic authenticity. The conflict among these sources produces the central impasse of the Socratic problem. Every attempt to privilege one account undermines the credibility of others, yet synthesizing them produces an incoherent composite. Plato's Socrates denies knowledge and refuses payment. Xenophon Socrates offers instruction and accepts compensation. Aristophanes Socrates speculates about nature, and Aristotle Socrates avoids natural philosophy altogether. These contradictions are not mere discrepancies but fundamental differences in philosophical orientation. If Socrates truly held a consistent set of beliefs, those beliefs are not transparently recoverable from the extant evidence. Scholars have proposed numerous solutions to this problem, particularly from the 19th century onward, when historical critique methods were applied rigorously to ancient texts. One influential approach was to identify the real Socrates with the figure found in Plato's early dialogues. On the assumption that these works were closer in time to Socrates' life and less philosophically developed, this developmental hypothesis holds that Plato gradually transformed Socrates into a vehicle for his own thought. While attractive, the view depends on contested assumptions about the chronology of Plato's work and the idea that philosophical simplicity necessarily indicates historical proximity. Alternative views argue that Plato's corpus represents a unified literary philosophical project rather than a chronological record of intellectual development, undermining the real early versus late distinction. Other scholars have attempted to define Socrates minimally, focusing on traits that appear consistently across sources. These sources these include his profession of ignorance, his use of questioning to expose fake knowledge, and his ethical focus on how ought to live. This minimalist reconstruction avoids doctrinal commitments but adds close philosophical substance. What remains is a method and an attitude rather than a philosophy in the full sense, raising the question of whether such a thin account meaningfully captures Socrates as a thinker or merely preserves a symbolic archetype. A more radical position accepts that the Socratic problem is fundamentally insoluble. From this perspective, Socrates is best understood as not as a recoverable historical philosopher, but as a literary and philosophical construct whose meaning varies by author and context. Plato's Socrates, Xenophon's Socrates, and Aristophanes' Socrates are all legitimate objects of study, but they should not be conflated or reduced to a single historical essence. This view reflects a broader shift in scholarship away from positivist reconstruction towards the interpretive pluralism, recognizing the limits imposed by the evidence. The persistence of the Socratic problem is not a failure of scholarship but a consequence of the natural of the sources and the cultural role Socrates played. Socrates was not merely a private thinker but a public figure whose life and death became symbols in ongoing debates and philosophy, politics, religion, and education. Each author who wrote about him shaped his image to serve particular intellectual and rhetorical ends. The result is not a single Socrates, but a constellation of Socratic figures, each revealing more about the author and the cultural moment than about an objectively recoverable individual. Despite or perhaps because of this interminency, the Socratic problem remains philosophically insignificant. It forces reflection on how philosophical tradition constructs their origin, how authority is established through narrative, and how the absence of primary texts shapes intellectual history. The impossibility of pinning down the historical Socrates doesn't diminish the importance, rather, it amplifies it by revealing how foundational figures function as sites of contestation rather than repository of settled doctrine. In the end, the Socratic problem teaches a sobering lesson about the limits of historical knowledge, the imperative nature of philosophy itself. Socrates stands at the beginning of Western philosophy not as a fixed doctrine, but as a problem, a question mark embodied in a life. The inability to resolve the problem is not an accident, but a defining feature of his legacy. Socrates endures precisely because he cannot be fully possessed, reconstructed, or closed off. He remains in every sense an open question.